Welcome, guys. So, a question I've gotten a lot recently is what is the best EQ to use for your AirPods Max, and how does that play into the headphone accommodation settings that there's been so much talk about over the last couple of years? So, in this video, I want to share my experiences with using different EQs and Apple Music, and what you should probably know about how the headphone accommodations actually work and how they're different from an EQ because they're not the same thing, and where you would and wouldn't use either one, and why you probably don't want to use them both together. So, to start out with, it's understandably a little tricky to know what EQ you're going to want to use for any of your music, since Apple doesn't really offer any sort of an explanation on their drop-down list of presets of what any of them are going to do. Some of them are obvious, like increased bass or increased treble, but do you really know what folk is going to do? Just by looking at it, I don't. But through a lot of experimentation, I would say generally I use the electronic setting. It boosts the things that I'm looking for the most. It gives it sort of a mild V shape, which is not super ideal. I wish there was a way to tell it leave the mids alone and just kind of give me a little bit more bass. I don't like as much bass of a boost as the increased bass. That's all it does is boost the bass up, and it also seems to come at the expense of some treble, so I don't really like that setting. But if I had to pick one EQ that I would say it's a good all-around EQ that I could put it on and leave it for pretty much any genre of music, it would be electronic. It gives you a boost in the bass and a little bit of an extra bit of brightness, a little more sparkle to the highs. It doesn't make the highs shrill, but the AirPods Max, because they're trying to be such a neutral headphone, if you're delving into I want EQ, you've already decided you don't want a neutral headphone. And so I find the little bit of extra sparkle in the highs and the little bit punchier bass is nice. Everybody in the initial reviews described the AirPods Max as having awesome, like really powerful bass. I don't know that I would say that. They handle bass well when the track has a lot of bass in it, but they are aimed at trying to be fairly neutral, and that's fine, not throwing shade at that, but I'm a person who likes punchy bass, and so I have always felt, listening to the AirPods Max, that they could use a little bit more bass, and so the electronic EQ, to me, does that. The closest runner-up I found is the hip-hop setting. It does similar effects, it sounds like, to the music, but I find, interestingly enough, that the electronic boosts the really low, like rumbly subwoofer level bass a little bit more than hip-hop does, which is why that hip-hop wouldn't be my general preference. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys there if you're looking for it. I assume that most people that are looking for some kind of EQ, that's more or less the type of EQ that they're probably looking for. Otherwise, you can throw your questions below and we can sort through it together. Headphone accommodations. So when that first was introduced, there was a lot of content out there that described it as like secret settings and stuff. Let's not get carried away, really. But those are doing kind of a similar thing to what EQ is doing, but it works differently. So an EQ is like, say, the electronic. It has a set range of frequencies, certain bass frequencies, certain high frequencies that it's going to boost, and it does that no matter what. So no matter what song you're listening to, no matter how much bass there is or isn't in the song, it's going to boost it by whatever amount. And it's going to do it by that amount no matter what. The headphone accommodations is sort of a moment-by-moment dynamic EQ, you might say. And what they say, the balanced tone, on the three settings that it gives you, you have balanced, vocal, and brightness. Balanced is trying to go through the entire frequency and just say, what are quieter sounds that a person might have a little bit of trouble hearing amidst everything else, and can I elevate those a little bit so that they stand out more on top of everything else? This can lead to the perception of more detail in the headphones, and you might put it on and say, wow, my AirPods Max sound higher quality now. And if that's the perception you get out of them, it's most likely because some of those little fine details you just weren't hearing very well otherwise without this setting on. Could just be because the track isn't mixed that well, or those details were meant to be very quiet, or it could be that, like all of us, at some point in life, you've suffered some degree of hearing loss, even if it's not, severe. And if any of those things are true, bumping up those quieter frequencies in that given moment can allow you, of course, to hear them more easily, and you then have this perception of like, wow, I'm hearing way more detail than before. These headphones sound great. And there's nothing against that. If that's your experience, I've used it a bit myself. There are times when I find it helpful, depending on the headphone. I don't generally use headphone accommodations on the AirPods Max because I feel like they're high quality enough in their sound that I don't really think that it benefits a whole lot from that. Your mileage may differ. When I have used the basic AirPods, though, I definitely noticed that the headphone accommodations helped a lot because those headphones don't really have the same degree of detail. The second generation, I should clarify, really lacking in the high end. And so with that mode on, it really kind of brings them to life in a useful way. But it's deciding moment per moment how to apply that. Same for vocal range or for the brightness modes. You're just telling it full range, middle of the road, or the upper end. Where should it focus most on trying to bring out some of those quieter details? But that's obviously very different than an EQ because it's deciding which frequencies to boost and by how much based on whatever is dynamically happening in the song in that moment. And it can change moment to moment. It could even change if you adjust the headphones on your head and there's a slightly different seal between the headphones and your head. It can make adjustments to keep the sound more consistent based on that kind of stuff. An EQ is not going to do any of that. So that can, in a way, have sort of an advantage over an EQ if that's what you're going for, especially, like I said, for people with some degree of hearing loss. And a lot of folks that I've read in Reddit and other sites that have hearing loss have said that this helps them quite a bit to get more out of their recordings and to hear things better, which is really nice. You can even, if you want to go to that degree, you can use, I think it's called Mimi, is the hearing test app. I did it a couple of years ago. You can take a hearing test with an app with the AirPods on, and it can determine which frequencies you don't hear quite as well as others, and then you can import that custom audiogram that it creates into the headphone accommodation section, and you could use that instead of the balanced vocals or brightness to basically tell it, take what frequencies I specifically don't hear as well and be looking at those to be the ones that you dynamically are adjusting, which is kind of cool that you can do that. Where it's a disadvantage, though, or may not be as helpful to you, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, as EQ is, for instance, if I, like I said in the beginning of this, say, I want punchier bass, well, the headphone accommodations is not necessarily going to do that. With any kind of music that has a decent degree of bass in it, the headphone accommodations, while it scans the audio frequencies in that given moment, is probably going to say, oh, well, there's already a pretty good amount of bass in the song, so I don't need to do anything with that. And so it's probably giving you nothing. It, to some degree, can even work against the EQ if it's saying, I'm going to boost a whole bunch of mid-range details here up to a level where now the contrast between the mids and the bass is lower than it used to be, which can trick your ear into thinking that there's less bass perceived in that moment. So it can kind of sometimes work against EQ in some circumstances. In others, they play nice together, but you can wind up where if you're using them both together, it can be kind of too much fiddling, and it can sound over-processed. Certain instruments can start to sound unnatural. The balance of that instrument against other instruments can be too much. If too many things enhancing the bass or some mid-bass frequencies at the same time can make it sound sort of muddy and sloppy. So generally, I agree with most people when I say my recommendation would be you probably don't want to use EQ and headphone accommodations at the same time. You're probably wanting to pick one of the other, whichever one makes more sense to you. You might say headphone accommodations if you have a very specific use case, like I like that it just dynamically brings out all those little extra details, and I'm mostly interested and I just want more details. Cool. Headphone accommodations is probably ideal for you in the balanced mode or the vocal mode or even the brightness mode, depending on where you find the extra details coming out is the most useful to you based on your hearing and your preferences. That might be the best situation for you. Generally, I actually go the opposite route. If I'm going to use one of them, I generally am using EQ because, like I said a minute ago, it's not going to punch up the bass and stuff the way that I want it to. And so for me, the electronic EQ setting is more, generally speaking, useful when I listen to music on the AirPods Max. Now, that's only sometimes when I'm on Bluetooth. If I'm using off of my computer or iPad an external DAC with my much higher end headphones, I'm not using the EQ in Apple Music at all because I can control the EQ through my other hardware, and so I'm fine. But as far as the AirPods are concerned, that would be an example of where you might choose to use the EQ instead, because you're saying, I don't want you to be deciding to make certain adjustments to the sound based on the song. I want you to just universally boost the bass by a certain amount. So that a song with very little bass, well, it's getting boosted so that it's a little better. And a song that already has pretty good bass, well, with that boost, it's like really thumpy and satisfying. Hope that's kind of helpful, giving an explanation of where you would kind of use one and not the other. If you have questions related to this as you're listening to it, throw them in the comments below. I'll do what I can to answer them. It's questions like this that feed my new content. This whole video itself is based on questions I've gotten before. I appreciate you stopping by and watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.